This is a video I actually once recorded and am now re-recording because basically Shoe0nHead did her stream on Sargon last night, and if I'm going to be honest about this topic, I'm going to have to incorporate some of what she said into the original script. And the original script started something like this. Sargon and Shoe are both wrong. And they're wrong in different ways for different reasons, but they're both wrong. For those of you who don't know, this is about some ongoing drama, and I'll have the videos for both of them linked in the description if you want to go back and check it out for yourself. Now, when watching those previous videos, I realized that Sargon believes he has stayed exactly the same in terms of his overall political views and his principles, while Shoe has spun off radically left into communism. Meanwhile, Shoe says she's stayed the same in her principles, while Sargon is going far right. This is the progression of Sargon's political compass. I know it looks like shit, I pulled it off of his videos. As you can see, back in 2015, he was libertarian left of center, and now he is libertarian right of center. And here's Shoe's political compass. In 2015, she was libertarian left of center, and now she is significantly more libertarian and significantly more left. What's interesting is that when you look at both of these, you realize that they started in the same place. And it's probably why they were such good friends in 2014 and 2015. But after the massive reorientation of the political landscape, due to basically Brexit and Trump in 2016, you can see they both shifted. And it looks like they both shifted in about an equal measure, which is probably why they both believe the other person has changed wildly while they haven't changed at all. The actual truth is, they've both changed an equal amount. Oh, by the way, just for comparison's sake, this is my political compass. The blue is where I would have been had this test existed back in like 2007, and the red is where I have been for nearly the past decade. Now, some people would say that the fact that I've stayed where I am for as long as I have means that I'm still living in the past, or I'm stagnant or something. However, I don't think so. I think it's that I've done a lot of reading, and I've come into some very firmly held beliefs that aren't going to be swayed by the politics of the day. But we've got Shoe talking about how Sargon is now far right, and Sargon's talking about how Shoe is far left. And I think to really get a grip on the situation, we have to ask the question, what is the left? Because there are sometimes people who tell me that I'm far right, or I'm right wing or something. And then I ask them, well, okay, what do you think the left is? Like, what do you think the left edge on the center is? What is the rightmost political opinion that is still on the left that you can hold? And these people almost inevitably say dismantling capitalism, which means that they have to think that Shoe0nHead's social democrat policies of keeping capitalism intact, but using taxation to maintain a broad safety net, which, by the way, are also my ideal policies, those people have to think that that's right wing somehow, because capitalism's still intact. Meanwhile, people on the right have called me an actual communist because of my support for those social safety nets. And I know that, like, left and right changes based on the Overton window. I know, for example, the serfs called me right-wing because even though I held positions that were leftist 20 years ago, I haven't changed, and they believe that history is supposed to go more leftward over time, which it just isn't the case. So it really sounds like left and right are too nebulous to be used. However, I think I've come to the root of the problem. The left-right political spectrum came out of the French Revolution, and its original meaning was in relation to hierarchy. At this time, the right wing believed that hierarchy was innately destructive, while at the same time being inevitable. So the point of human politics was to understand and accept the natural hierarchies of the world, but to not create any more man-made hierarchies than were absolutely necessary. This is why you had both your small government types, as well as your monarchists and loyalists on the right, because they believed that the monarchy was a hierarchy of the natural world, wherein divine right came from God, and so the hierarchy was God, kings, nobles, and peasants. The left wing, meanwhile, had a different relationship with hierarchy. They believed hierarchy was just as destructive as the right wing did. However, they believed that hierarchy could be tamed by human intervention. While the right wing did not believe in constructing a man-made hierarchy because hierarchy itself was destructive, the left wing believed that if humans could replace natural hierarchies with man-made hierarchies, they could control them for people's wider benefit. Their philosophy was not to avoid hierarchy because it's destructive, but to harness hierarchy and make it constructive. This had the strange effect of not only having the monarchists, the anarchists, and the proto-libertarians all on the right wing, but also the socialists and the fascists on the left wing, because both socialism and fascism seek to create a centralized, planned society, which is completely in line with the 1800s leftist philosophy of replacing natural hierarchy with man-made hierarchy. And although it sounds very strange to us nowadays, because on the modern left-right political spectrum, we put fascism as far right, but Georges Valois, France's first fascist of any note, began his political career as an anarcho-syndicalist. He viewed fascism as left-wing, and as coming out of his own experiences with socialism. And he saw fascism as the natural extension and inheritor of the Jacobin movement from the late 1700s. The Jacobins were one of the most radically left-wing revolutionary groups within the French Revolution. They were a group of working-class Paris citizens that played vital roles during the French Revolution. Of course, the modern conception of the left and the right has completely lost all of this nuance, mainly because after it became popularized within the French Republic, the Americans picked it up, and as the Americans like to do, they completely watered it down beyond any and all actual meaning. Thanks, America. So now modern-day political discourse is basically just shit-flinging over who's left, who's right, who's far left, who's far right. No, you're actually the radical one. No, you're actually the radical one. When most of it is just a complete misunderstanding. However, not all of it. And this is where we actually talk about the specific things where Sargon and Shoe are wrong. During Shoe's stream, she mentioned she didn't understand the link between communism and woke shit. And I don't think Sargon did a very good job at explaining it necessarily. So maybe I can do it in more layman's terms.
I don't understand her objection to woke politics without also not being a communist.
Now he's like, I don't understand how you can reject woke shit and also not be a communist? Where the fuck did that come from? I thought the entire thing was, we are on the left but we're bothered by some things on the left.
Woke shit is the application of Marxist theory to vectors of oppression beyond simply class. Now, Shoe says that she doesn't mind being called a class justice warrior, and there is definitely this idea among some elements of the left that there is no war but class war. However, if you take Marxist theory and apply it to the social sphere rather than the economic one, you get identity politics. You get woke shit. You get intersectionality. In fact, if you take like a women's studies class in university, one of the first things you learn is that the Marxist conception of class and class warfare is simply one bar on the cage of intersectionality, alongside race and gender and sexual orientation and all these other things. It is very easy to see how woke shit is the natural end result of Marxist theory. Shoe also said in her stream that she doesn't see the problem with socialism even though she's not a socialist herself.
The people who think socialism is some, like, authoritarian thing, it's not. And so when they think of that, they think of, like, the tankies. They think of, like, Stalin and all that shit, and it scares them. And I think that's where these people are coming from. But they're completely different ideologies.
And the honest truth is, no. Socialism is just as bad as fascism, for multiple reasons. Firstly, if you read the theory, and I have read the theory, you know, I have read Das Kapital. If you read the theory, you understand that the political system and the economic system can't really be disentangled.
Comparing Nazis to socialists is, like, not valid at all. At all. No. Workers' rights and shit like that compared to people who want, like, racial purity and all of this shit are two completely different things, and Dev keeps doing it. Like, I'm friends with Dev, but he keeps conflating the socialists to the Nazis.
Socialism isn't the government does shit. Socialism is not workers' rights. It's not healthcare. Socialism isn't an intact capitalism with safety nets. Socialism is property expropriation. It is seizing the means of production. And you know, I get it. The old Marxist conception required a revolution. It was going to require a violent uprising of the worker to steal all of this property. And there are new versions of socialism. You know, you read your Chomsky, you see the libertarian socialists out there. And it's not going to require a violent revolution, guys. We're just going to vote it. You know, you're democratic socialist, you're libertarian socialist. You're just going to vote yourself property. Well, that is still fundamentally tyrannical. Because let's say you own a business, and let's say you've hired some workers. And the workers all say, okay, we're going to vote that we own your business now. And the owner says, no, fuck off. I founded it, you know, however many years ago it was. I was working on it before I hired any of you. There is no good reason why you should own it simply because you work here. And at that point, the democratic socialism, the libertarian socialism completely falls apart. Because either you have to give up and go home, or you're going to have to use violence to take the property. Now maybe that's state-backed violence. And if that's the case, you're going to become the Soviet Union a whole lot faster. Maybe it's union-based violence. Maybe it's a grassroots uprising by the workers. But all of these things are still theft. And they're all going to lead to an authoritarian state. Like, I've read Chomsky. I had to read him in school. I know you don't want to hear this, because he's well regarded among the left. He's considered an intellectual. People love this guy. But when it comes to his libertarian socialism, if ever seriously put into practice, it will end up like its authoritarian brother. Because you will always have to use extreme amounts of force to make people play along with it. And this is coming from a former Chomsky fan, man. I had stars in my eyes about him once too, until I decided to read all theory, not just socialist theory. In the same way, Shoe was also wrong about fascism.
And I know people are like, wait, but Nazis were socialists. Yes, because Germany was socialist. Or, well, they were, you know, they had like healthcare and shit like that. So... yeah, Nazis were, they adopted the socialist thing because that was what was popular at the time, like, to get into power.
No, the fascists did not simply use socialist rhetoric until they got into power. You're probably referencing here Hitler's 25-point plan, which was put up by the Nazi Party, I think, in 1923, and it had a lot of socialist points on it. Like, it talked about old age welfare, it talked about care for the middle and lower classes, it talked about the expropriation of land for the purposes of public utility. It talked about outlawing child labor and education programs and things like this. This was not simply a ruse on behalf of the fascists. These are actually core components of fascist policy because, again, due to the old conception of the left and its relation to hierarchy. This is a topic for another video, but a lot of people on the left believe that liberal and fascist economics are identical because they're both capitalist, and that's just not the case. There actually is a distinct fascist theory of economics, separate from both liberalism and socialism. But again, that's another topic for another time. I mean, there is a reason why in the Doctrine of Fascism, Mussolini wrote about his political opponents, including socialists, being reactionaries, or how they wanted to seize the means of production, and it was not simply co-opting their language. There's something deeper there. And I know where you get this definition of fascism. It's where all of BreadTube gets the definition of fascism that they use. It's from Umberto Eco's Your Fascism essay. And I had the displeasure of reading Umberto Eco even before I became a YouTuber, I think. In the class where I read the essay, Fascism, my political science professor said, there's a reason why Eco is known outside of Italy for his novels and not his political analysis. The 14 points presented in Fascism are so ridiculously broad that any authoritarianism, fascism or otherwise, can meet this criteria. Even some non-authoritarians can meet this criteria. And if this list is how people on the left identify fascism, it is no wonder that they see fascists everywhere. It's no wonder that you think Trump is a fascist. And frankly, Trump's not a fascist, he's just an idiot. Eco's work, in terms of political science, is considered like the opposite of the gold standard when it comes to identifying a fascist. If you want an actual coherent definition of fascism, there's Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, or Roger Griffin's The Nature of Fascism. Or if you just really like the idea of a checklist you can just run down and mark off very simply, check out Emilio Gentile's The Sacralization of Politics. I've read these works. I've read Fascism. Admittedly, it's been a while. It was back when I was still in university taking political science. But I've read this stuff. And guess what? By all those other metrics, Trump isn't a fascist.
Why the fuck do we know everything about them, but they know nothing about us? Why the fuck do we use all their correct labels? This one's a libertarian, this one's a neocon, this one's a classical liberal, this one's a nationalist, and they just turn around and call whole-ass libs commies.
Now, maybe it's because I consider myself at least slightly left of center here, but I can in fact tell the differences between all the different flavors of leftism. And I do think Sargon is wrong to call them all communism. There's an obvious difference between the tankies and the anarcho-communists and the anarcho-syndicalists and the libertarian socialists and the social democrats and so on and so forth. And you can't simply boil them all down to just straight communism. Because frankly, communism is the theorized, stateless, moneyless, classless society that exists after socialism has been perfectly implemented, which is itself a wildly reductionary point of view. However, the problem with all of these different flavors of leftism is that once you cross the threshold into property expropriation, like I said earlier, they all turn out the same way. To take property from those who don't want it stolen, and to legitimize that taking beyond simple thievery, you will need some kind of totalitarian state apparatus. It doesn't matter if you call yourself an anarcho-communist or whatever. The anarcho part is ultimately meaningless. It will by necessity be washed aside in the pursuit of your own goals. All forms of socialism, libertarian or not, will eventually become the Soviet Union. The only difference is how long it takes for you to get there. All this being said, Sargon's not perfect either. Like I mentioned, not everything on the left is simple communism. There are in fact socialists who simply want to be socialists. They don't want to advance to the next stage, which is communism. They want to implement a socialist society and then stay in a socialist society. I don't agree with them because that would ultimately be tyrannical and would lead to something that looks a lot like fascism. However, you can't call them communists because that's not what they are and that's not what they believe. Moreover, just like how Shoe says she hasn't shifted when she actually has, Sargon, you've shifted too. You keep calling yourself a liberal, but frankly, I don't think you are anymore. I think you're a conservative. And I'm not using that word in a negative way at all. I don't have a natural knee-jerk reaction to hate conservatives like a lot of people do. You know this yourself. You know it better than me, that conservatism as a political tradition comes out of liberalism. They are two sides of the same coin. The liberals, not in terms of like the mimetic way that the term is used, like how the left refers to the libs or the right refers to the libs, but the actual political philosophy of liberalism. It starts at the same premise as conservatism. Their difference is not on whether or not the state should be overthrown or whether democracy should disappear or anything along those lines. The difference is in the minutiae of how the system works. But they both start from the same premise that the system is fundamentally good, that the nation and the culture in which you inhabit is worth preserving on some level. The conservatives want to conserve, the liberals want to liberate, but both still within that framework of the night watchman state. And sometimes the liberals are correct for a given situation, sometimes the conservatives are. So it's not like I'm using the term conservative as a slur. I just think at this point, Sargon, that is where you fall politically. It's not bad, it's not evil, it's not wrong. It's just you, and I don't blame you. I mean, you're a dad now. You've got a son and a daughter, and I know that you're trying for more, so, like, who's not going to become a conservative under those conditions? It's not bad, it's not wrong, it's just what it is. And speaking of kids, yes, we're going to have to talk about the whole women have a duty to have kids thing. I'm pretty sure you phrase it that way because you want to trigger people, primarily, and, you know, fair enough, it can be funny sometimes. Because I also know that you think that men have a duty to have kids, it's not just women. But what you're appealing to here, fundamentally, is the duty to contribute to a society that has brought you up. And fair enough, I just don't think that having children is the only way that you can do that. And to be honest, I think the capitalist conception of things works quite well. If you have money, that means you've performed labor. Or if you're an investor, you've taken on risk. But for most people, it means you've performed labor. And that labor is itself your contribution. If you can pay for something, that means that you have contributed enough so that you may have it. You do not need to have kids in order to justify buying your house or paying your grocery bill or whatever it is. Fundamentally, you should have kids because you want to have kids, because that's what you want to do with your life and your time and your energy. We already know how bad it can be when people who don't want kids have kids, how it ruins the parent's life, how it definitely ruins the child's life. It's only a contribution if you want them, because if you want them, then you're going to raise them right. And of course, the problem with using the word duty is that most people don't understand. I understand, but most people don't understand that duty is not something that you're forced to do. A duty is something that you voluntarily pick up. So when you say something like, you have a duty to have children, that doesn't mean that you want the state to force you to have children. It means that you have a duty, and you can choose not to fulfill that duty. It is a voluntary burden, which is the difference between duty and responsibility, where responsibility is not voluntary. When you have a responsibility, you have to do that thing. When you have a duty, you should do that thing. So I see what you're saying, but, and this has also been a pretty consistent problem, I think, is that, Sargon, you often don't properly unpack your points. Another instance of this is where you say, what is the definition of woman? Again, I know what you're saying, but most people just think you're crazy. Frankly, because your point is the definition of woman is adult human female, it's very simple, it's concise, and the left does not have a definition of woman that simultaneously includes trans women and also isn't circular. I understand your point. This applies to both the duty thing and the definition of woman thing. I think you forget that you've been doing this for like 6 years. And for most people who are not this deep into it, they kind of need some concepts unpacked first. You can't simply spring a question on them and then watch as they are confused, and then you go, haha, I owned you. Well, no, not really, unfortunately. The confusion that you're seeing is not them being owned as they struggle to say something that actually makes coherent sense, but rather, it's them thinking you're insane. You also said on a stream recently that you didn't think universal suffrage was the way to go. Now, you were saying this offhand, so maybe you were just, I don't know, working through an idea and it's not a firmly held belief or something. But your logic was that why should people who not net pay into the system through taxation have a vote in where those taxes go through democracy? And I get what you're saying, but I disagree. It's appropriate in the private sector for things to be a little bit more dictatorial. I know that the left-leaning types, the socialists, they're not going to like to hear that, but it's the honest truth. If you own your property, you have the exclusive right to enjoy that property in any way that you see fit. If you own a company, you have the exclusive right to control that company, to hire and fire, to drive it into the ground if you want to. But governments aren't companies. Public property is not private property. Just as there is a private sphere because not everything is political, despite what the left will tell you, there is also a public sphere. There is a place where, within those boundaries, everything is actually political. And I do think it's important that specifically within that zone, everyone has their voice heard. Because everybody has to live in the country that is created by the government that we vote in. It is appropriate for a democratic government to have universal suffrage for the same reasons that it is appropriate for a company not to. This is the unfortunate nature of being a content mill, like Crowder, or like Ben Shapiro, or like Vosh or the Serfs. And Sargon, this applies to you too. Do you recall how Christy Winters was viewed a few years ago? How basically she would constantly release videos, and those videos were always like worthy of somebody else just putting on while they play a game on a stream or something and then talking over and laughing at? That is what everyone's become, including you to an extent. Yes, Vosh and the Serfs have become this. Yes, Crowder and Shapiro have become this. Packman and Kalinsky and everyone else. And you. Everyone nowadays seems to be a constantly producing content mill, and all of their opponents simply take that content and create their own content. Easy response videos, laughs, even if they don't actually have any real criticism. And I mean, you and I both know, you go and watch Vosh critiquing anything, and there's never any real criticism there. It's usually him like stumbling and going, what? I don't understand. How could you possibly, like there's nothing really there of substance, but it feeds his base. This is not just an optics complaint, because I know you don't care about optics, and frankly, neither do I. It's more like, I keep meeting people, good people, well-intentioned people, and you have too. I mean, remember our conversation with Lilith, right? Who have these preconceptions about you that are completely wrong, and I know they're completely wrong, and you know they're completely wrong, but it's because you have allowed people who dislike you to interpret you uncharitably. Like, yeah, 4 years ago the SJW said you were an ethno-nationalist and everyone could see it wasn't true. But the number of people who are saying it now has increased like 100-fold. And it's all good people who, if they knew the truth, wouldn't be saying it. And in fact, I think ceding ground like this has been a consistent problem with you and how you operate. I know it was you, I, and Arch who had that private conversation about compassion and the nature of compassion and how compassion intersects with politics. And how basically conservatives, and in some cases liberals, to their detriment, have completely ceded the idea of compassion to the socialists. And like you and I both know, the socialists aren't actually compassionate at all. Property expropriation is not compassionate, despite how they claim they want to make the world a better place, or redistribute, or help the poor, or whatever it is. We both know exactly what they mean by that, exactly what will happen when they do that, and it's nothing that's even remotely related to compassion. However, the concept of compassion has been ceded to the far left. And frankly, I think that's a problem, because I do think it's possible for there to be a compassionate right. There's definitely a space for a compassionate center. And I do think that that comes with equal parts self-empowerment and social assistance where it's needed and where it would be productive. But simply hand-waving that as bleeding heart hippie leftists is not going to help the situation. You've always been content to ignore those people around you who might be working against you, and fair enough, because most of the time it's just internet shit, it's just gay ops, right? However, I've always said that it is better to defeat an opponent on their own turf. It is better to accept their terms and still beat them. And I know for a fact that is possible with the radical left. I know for a fact it's possible with the socialists. In the same vein, you and I have had a conversation on where it's actually appropriate that the government step into a marketplace and intervene. And I laid out 3 criteria that you disagreed with, but I didn't really understand why. I said when something is rarely used, but is universally necessary when it is used, and is extremely expensive, then the government has a mandate to step in, maybe communalize the service so that everyone pays into a pot and everyone withdraws from it when they need it, and ensures that everyone has at least some access to that service. And while that's not going to be as efficient as the free market, it is going to be more fair. So for example, this works with roads. You are not going to use every single road that your government has built in your country. However, everyone needs roads, and they are expensive to make. So it does make sense that the government enforces some minimum of standard beyond what the market would bear. This logic makes sense for roads, it makes sense for fire and police, it makes sense for healthcare, in my opinion. But where I break with Shoe and the socialists is that I don't think it makes sense for food or for housing. Because in terms of food, it's not rarely used, it's commonly used, it is universally necessary, and it's not prohibitively expensive the way that roads or fire or police or healthcare is. And it doesn't work with housing because unlike those 4 other examples, which are services, housing is a good. When you buy a house, you have exclusive rights to that house. You own that house as property. There is nothing universal about owning a house. It is very exclusive in that regard. And of course, there are other things that you're both wrong about as well. I agree with Shoe on the whole flag burning thing. I'm worried about Trump talking about making it illegal. It should not be illegal at all. There are Trump simps out there who are saying, oh, it's only 1 year. No, 1 second in jail is 1 second too many for burning a flag. At the same time, I also understand that your point was lost on Shoe, because the issue isn't burning the flag, the issue is why do they want to burn it? And do they have real grievances? And frankly, the answer for a lot of them is no. A lot of people that you see rioting out there, they're not the working poor. They're rich kids, sometimes middle-class kids, who have been radicalized and are committing violence thinking they're doing something good. Simple as that. I know that this doesn't apply to Shoe, I know that she's ultimately a patriot, but there is definitely a strain of leftism out there that is very anti-American. And while the flag burning isn't a problem, the whole no Trump, no wall, no USA at all mentality that is behind the flag burning is absolutely a problem. And in the same way, I think you're also both wrong about George Floyd. Shoe called Sargon a fentanyl truther, which is, in my opinion, ridiculous. A police officer kneeling on the neck of a violent person is standard procedure and almost never actually results in anybody's death. And in fact, it would not have resulted in George Floyd's death had he not been overdosing on fentanyl at the exact same time. This is indisputable. It's in the autopsy. You're not a fentanyl truther for saying this. But at the same time, you cannot simply believe that the police acted completely appropriately. They obviously didn't. The police are first responders. They do have a duty of care to those that they arrest. They have a level of responsibility above and beyond that of an average passerby to make sure that someone doesn't die while in their custody. It doesn't matter what George Floyd was guilty of. He should have seen his day in court. That is where justice is served. And yes, I've seen the body cam footage. They were struggling with him. It was a nasty situation. However, when they had him on the ground and he was overdosing, their actions absolutely exacerbated the situation, and they are responsible for that. Anyway, that's that for now. I know I talked about doing SFO streams. Those will probably be starting tomorrow, I think. This will probably be the last video until I can get a handle on the monetization situation. Maybe I'll do something else if it strikes me, but like, I have several very large video essays planned, like on the scale of the Chaz one, that I'm just going to hold off on. So I'll be streaming probably more Carrion tonight on Twitch if you want to drop by. And I'll be live hopefully tomorrow with some kind of SFO stream. So I'll see you there. I love you.